Well, welcome to the Jordan Center. My name is Rasen Jagolov. I teach in the Russian and Slavic Studies department here, and I really thank you all for coming. Um, yes, and it's really my great pleasure to be introducing Christy Monet, who is a Jordan Center postdoctoral fellow here. Uh, Christie's research straddles two worlds that have very rarely met, that of Slavic literatures and political science, which both conspired at the University of Chicago to confer upon her a joint PhD last year. She also holds an MA in International Relations, also from the University of Chicago, and her undergraduate degrees from St. Mary's College in Maryland. Her research interests, broadly within the realm of intellectual history, political thought, and literary studies, and she teaches political theory, literature, history with a focus on Russophone political thought and its engagement with the question of empire, with liberalism and American culture in the last 2 centuries. Um, uh, Christie's current book project on the family novel in Imperial Russia explores the ways in which the development of liberal thought in 19th century Russia created space for reimagining of both the form of family and its role in the political. This line of inquiry is based partly on research undertaken in both Moscow and Petersburg in the archives of the Russian State Library and the Pushkin House, with the support of numerous distinguished fellowships, yes, which I will skip. But now, what Christy will be presenting right now will be something completely different, um, uh, based on an article she's writing and entitled Imagined Kin, International Solidarities, Evgenia Nekrasova's Skin, Kozha, a recent novel, I think from 2022, is Embodied Empathy. Thank you, Christy, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rasen. Yeah, and so this is, well, at least I want it to be more of a sort of informal talking conversation. This is sort of like a authoritative presentation on Nekrasova or Kozha. They're actually more of my thoughts as I gather them around this book, which really shocked, surprised, and delighted me in a lot of different ways, not just for its literary value, but also for sort of rich intertext. It has a lot of political text as well, contemporary and historical. So this is also sort of a labor of, I guess, my own positionality as a Black woman studying Slavic literature, studying Russian literature specifically, and also studying political theory. So just to give a little bit of context to what I was thinking about and what this novel made me think more about as I read it and after I read it. So myself, I was in Russia in November of 2008, when the US President Barack Obama was elected for his first term. And I was in the far east of Russia, as in Vladivostok. And I knew the news had happened. I was glad about it. But there was no other celebratory moments for me. I just went on about my way. I went to class, and I was really surprised because I remember passerbys, complete strangers to me, coming up to me on the street and sort of personally congratulating me, sort of genuinely, personally congratulating me in the back of my head. So I thought, like, well, maybe they think I'm, Malia Obama or Sasha Obama. But no, they just genuinely were just like, oh, congratulations, that's a big deal. It's like, oh. Oh, spasibo. And so that was just really interesting. I didn't think much more about it. I just thought it was a really unique and interesting thing that happened to me. Having not been in America for that election, but having voted abroad, from abroad as I was studying there. I was there again 4 years later in the far east of Russia, in Vladivostok in May of 2012, when Vladimir Putin's third inauguration was aired on national television there. I remember watching with some of my colleagues, sort of grimly. And I remember feeling a real sense of sort of foreboding and disappointment and kind of amorphous danger about the political future of Russia. I had watched President Medvedev in office, and there's a lot of speculation. Okay, he's just a puppet, but I was really hoping that there's somehow the political machinery in Russia and the people itself, somehow something, and Putin would not appear again for a third term. But he did, and it was very sad. And then in, a mere 4 years after that, these incredible 4-year increments, in November 2016, I found myself in America again. Not shocked, but still incredibly depressed at the election of Donald Trump as US president. And as the days and weeks and years went on, and I continued to travel back and forth to Russia for research. Let's see. Yes. Sorry. Oh, that slide's there. Right. So as the years went on, and I continued to travel to Russia for research. I started to find it incredibly frustrating that many of not only my Russian friends and colleagues, but also German friends and colleagues, British friends and colleagues, French friends and colleagues couldn't understand or engage deeply, or maybe take the time to really consider why I and some of my other Black American friends and colleagues considered Trump's election, like in 2016, a really deep tragedy for the United States. So many times, especially early on, I run into comments like, America will be fine. Its political institutions are so robust, they're so strong. Trump can only do so much damage in 4 years. Or at least you guys don't have an analog to XYZ, European, Eastern European, Central European, at least you don't have an analog to Putin. At least that's not happening. It's not so bad. Or Trump's election was an aberration and it won't repeat itself. So all these conversations usually involve me finally expressing my opinions on America's long political history as I saw it, the unfinished work of Reconstruction at the end of the 19th century, the parallel histories of anti-immigrant sentiment and widespread anti-Black violence at the beginning of the 20th century, insufficiency of legal voting rights at addressing and reconciling the racial hatred that was displayed during the decades-long civil rights movement. It felt like every quote-unquote victory that was received by Black Americans and others watching, quote-unquote victories for Black Americans, was followed by a new wave of terror and violence led by white American resentment. The end of slavery and the Civil War, followed by Jim Crow, the KKK, and the height of lynching. The Civil Rights Movement, followed by an increase in mass incarceration and the so-called war on drugs or crime. And more recently, President Barack Obama's election and administration, followed by a birther conspiracy that questioned his Americanness, the rise of the Tea Party movement, and finally the rise of Trump's MAGA movement around his presidential election bid. Every time I bring up the correlation between the rhetoric and policies of Trump's administration and these predictable racialized resentments on the heels of perceived Black victory and white loss, I could see in my Russian, German, British, French interlocutors' eyes and hear in their non-responses that they either did not fully believe this history or they did not want to fully give these concerns credence. They did not want to assent to even the possibility of the truth of my personally and academically informed historical understandings, which I offered them in this contemporary political moment. They cannot assent to this possibility, even as they admitted the confusing nature of the contemporary moment for themselves. I once asked a German colleague why he was so reluctant to see racism as a real problem in the United States, as a real ongoing, current, contemporary problem in the United States. He replied that he guessed it was because he never experienced the truth of American anti-Black racism himself personally. I then asked, how could I, as I do, or he, as he did, support, for example, Ukraine and its struggle against Russian oppression without question, even though he had never himself personally experienced Russian oppression personally as a Ukrainian. His response was, that's true. I had never thought about it like that. What I began to feel after many of these conversations was twofold. A real lack of international solidarity with my lived personal positionality and lived experience as a Black American woman, and a growing disappointment in the inability of my mostly white liberal colleagues, and even sometimes my white radical colleagues, to really take race seriously as a political problem in the same manner that they were comfortable, more than comfortable, taking class, gender, and even the environment seriously as political problems of the 21st century. Now, in the wake of Trump's second election, which came similarly to Putin's after a gap year of false hope that again, somehow the political machinery and the will of the people itself would not allow a return to this disastrous administration. This problem of what Juliet Hooker calls racialized political solidarity is even more acute, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, one of the narratives in the run-up to the 2024 election had been, for example, how Hispanic and Latino Americans would vote, as they are the fastest growing and now the largest racialized minority in the United States, followed by Black Americans. For the far-right political project, winning over Hispanic Latino populations would mean, in effect, never surrendering white majority status to a broader coalition of diverse populations in America. Unfortunately, Trump did break the Republican record for any presidential candidate among this voting bloc, winning 42% of the Hispanic Latino vote. He also outperformed his previous election results among white women, of which 43% voted for him, and Black men, of which 24% voted for him. And while women of color did vote for Trump at much lower rates than their male counterparts, even Asian voters, both male and female, both Southeast Asian, East Asian, and otherwise, voted for Trump at around an average of 30%, 40%. In an election where a candidate was set to make history as the first woman of color to become the president of the United States, it appeared that only Black women were firm in their rejection of Trump, granting him only 9% of their voting bloc. In 2016, so obviously Toni Morrison passed in 2019, but in 2016 she penned a letter to the New Yorker in which she began, "This is a serious project." She described Trump's agenda and support of it among many Americans as the abandonment of humanity or human dignity in service to an evil cause, and the translation of violence against the defenseless as strength. She even made an analogy between the United States as a nation and the household in Faulkner's Absalom, saying, rather than lose its whiteness, once again, the family chooses murder. This is not full screen anymore. That's okay. So that's sort of on the domestic side of things. Internationally, meanwhile, issues of political violence and oppression in Ukraine and Gaza, rightly so, continue to hold a lot of sway and media attention. Although on the other hand, the same cannot be said about similar issues in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Haiti. For grim reference here, the death toll in Gaza is so far approaching a horrific 50,000, with 70% reported as civilian casualties. While the civilian death toll during Ethiopia's 2020 to 2022 war in Tigray was upwards of 600,000. Not that most Americans would know that from any media coverage whatsoever. I also sort of, on the subject of contours and difference, I do appreciate the extreme similarity between the Sudanese flag and the Palestinian flag in this context. Again, I doubt that many of us would know the difference if we were not told. But obviously one of these images is much more familiar to us in the United States than the other. So here, for me, it's worth quoting Sylvia Wynter at length. Because what she describes in her decolonial work is something that I felt I could see in the work of Evgenia Nekrasova's novel Kozha. A problem and perhaps a gesturing towards some kind of steps, not even towards a solution or reconciliation, but steps towards acting on confronting that problem. So, as we saw here, make this big, sorry. So, I sort of used Juliet Hooker here to index this issue of solidarity, racialized solidarity, and the domestic context of the United States. But I think Sylvia Wynter does an incredible job, and I have she's done an incredible job of sort of extrapolating that to a global scale of what sort of racialized solidarity does and does not look like. And so she says, where Juliet Hooker says the problem of the 21st century is the problem of racialized solidarity, how to build democratic society across difference. Now that we know what the color line is, given she's echoing Du Bois's famous statement in the beginning of the 20th century that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line, right? Now that we know that, how do we actually move across this line? How do we confront this line? How do we move across it? If we say we want to. Sylvia Wynter says, actually, the struggle of our new millennium will be one between the ongoing imperative of securing the well-being of our present ethno-class, which she links to the Western bourgeois, ethno-class conception of the human itself. Man, which overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself, and that of securing the well-being and therefore the full cognitive and behavioral autonomy of human species, of ourselves. Because of this overrepresentation of man within the human, man as a no longer, as she puts it, no longer subject to the church as a sort of spiritual yet sinfully fallen creature, but this Western bourgeois conception of man, which she points back to the humanist Renaissance, this man is now a fully natural, physical, rational man. And this is what she thinks this sphere, this hegemonic sphere, conceives of as human. Who is human and who is not human is the primary distinction, rather than who is saved and who is not saved, for example. And this sort of bears out in the history of Reformation, the Renaissance, and then of course the Age of Discovery. While of course this is not a fully secular transition from thinking of man as the spiritual creature and the saved versus the unsaved, or the sinful versus the holy. While Christianity is still within this new representation of man that Sylvia Wynter is pointing to, by and large, what matters most is defining who is human by nature, physically, biologically, and who is subhuman. And this sort of is the problematic for her that she thinks is the biggest struggle for the 21st century. And she says, importantly, any attempt to unsettle the coloniality of power will call for unsettling this overrepresentation of physical, biological, natural man as such. Just to read her at length, I don't want to misquote her. She is a powerful thinker. She says, central to the struggle also is the usually excluded and invisibilized situation of the category identified by Zygmunt Bauman as the new poor. That is, as a category defined at the global level by refugee economic migrants stranded outside the gates of the rich countries, as the post-colonial variant of Fanon's category of the damned. With this category in the United States coming to comprise the criminalized majority Black and dark-skinned Latino inner city males, now made to man the rapidly expanding prison industrial complex. Together with their female peers, the kicked out welfare moms, with both being part of the ever-expanding global transracial category of the homeless, the jobless, the semi-jobless, the criminalized drug offending prison population. So that if we see this category of the damned that is internal to and interned within the prison system of the United States as the analog form of a new global archipelago constituted by the third and fourth world peoples of the so-called underdeveloped areas of the world, most totally of all by the peoples of the continent of Africa, now stricken with AIDS, drought, ongoing civil wars, and whose bottommost place as the most impoverished of all the Earth's continents is directly paralleled by the situation of its Black diaspora peoples, with Haiti being produced and reproduced as the most impoverished nation of the Americas. A systemic pattern emerges. The pattern is linked to the fact that while in the post-60s United States, the Black population group of all the multiple groups comprising the post-60s social hierarchy has once again come to be placed at the bottomest place of that hierarchy, with all incoming new non-white, non-Black groups coming to claim normal North American identity by the putting of visible distance between themselves and the Black population group. In effect, claiming normal human status by distancing themselves from the group that is still made to occupy the nadir rung of being human within the terms of our present ethnoclass. In the struggle of our times, one that has hitherto had no name is the struggle against its overrepresentation. And within her idea here, she has a very specific as well idea of what race is doing, what the construction of race does in this sort of pattern, systemic pattern. She says, the idea of race would come to be the most efficient instrument of social domination invented in the last 500 years. In order for the world of the laity, including that of the then ascendant modern European state, to escape their subordination to the world of the church, it had been able to do so only on the basis of what Michel Foucault identifies as the invention of man. That is, by the Renaissance humanist epical redescription of the human outside the terms of the then theocentric, sinful by nature conception or descriptive statement of the human, on whose basis the hegemony of the church clergy over the lay world of Latin Christian Europe had been supernaturally legitimated. While if this redescription was affected by the lay world's invention of man as the political subject of the state, in the transhumed and reoccupied place of its earlier matrix identity Christian, the performative enactment of this new descriptive statement and its master code of symbolic life and death as the first secular or de-godded, at the time only partially so, mode of being human in the history of the species was to be affected only on the basis of what Kozha identifies as the coloniality of power, or as the colonial difference, or as the project of demarcating human differences thinkable as a racial lingerie. One of the major empirical effects of which would be the rise of Europe and its construction of the world civilization on the one hand, and on the other, African enslavement, Latin American conquest, and Asian subjugation. So it was in this entire context of international solidarity and the problem of race and racialization that I was putting my thoughts together on Nekrasova's 2021 novel, Kozha, or Skin, as we might translate it. So Evgenia Nekrasova is a Russophone writer. She identifies herself as Maksha or Mordvinian. She was born in Kasputny Yar in Astrakhan Oblast and grew up in the Moscow region. Now she says sort of on the outskirts of the Moscow region. Her first novel, Velechina, or as she translates it on her site in English, Katya and Kikimora, debuted in 2018 and was subsequently nominated for several literary awards in Russia, including the Nos and Bolshaya Kniga prizes. In 2019, she published a collection of short stories entitled Sister Mom, continuing with her theme of fictional works based on women, the family, and the often violent tensions and magical paths to escape therein. In general, her fiction has been shortlisted for literary prizes alongside other contemporary classics of Russian literature, including the works of Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, Viktor Pryabin, Guzel Yakina, and Oksana Psyakina. Nekrasova released her second novel, Kozha, in 2021. This is sort of the same year she released a collection of short stories and poems entitled Domovaya Lubov, or Household Love, Home Love, one might translate it. On her author's website, she notes that she is a feminist who writes about women in today's Russia. She says her books explore the themes of corporality, power, violence, magic, and folklore, and that according to some critics, she is the founder of magical pessimism in contemporary Russian literature. She has also very notably been quoted as saying in Russian, and I'm sorry, I don't have the Russian quote for you here, but she's been quoted as saying, "Literature by Black women seems much closer to me as a Russian-speaking female reader and writer than 97% of all Russian literature." When Toni Morrison died in 2019, Nekrasova penned a whole article about it called Maya, Toni Morrison, and this is an excerpt from it in which she says, she references the Toni Morrison article from the New Yorker I already referenced in this presentation. She says in 2016, Morrison wrote for the New Yorker a text full of disappointment and anger at the election of Trump. She says Toni Morrison had an interesting, successful life full of love and books, and they say 88 is a venerable age, but I am sincerely saddened that she did not live to see what will be after Trump. Again, she's writing in 2016, right? And also that I will not be able to read her novel about it, what will be after Trump. Of course, we all know now what is after Trump is more Trump, which I'm sure Toni Morrison would have had a lot to say about. In any event, Toni Morrison is, Nekrasova has said, she recognizes her as a sort of author soulmate. And she sees The Bluest Eye as sort of a companion to her Kolechina, actually. So she's very influenced by Toni Morrison, and obviously it shows. In any event, back to her book Kozha. So Kozha was first published in 10 serialized installments on a Bookmak's original platform as an audiobook, sort of a serialized audiobook. And that was in 2021. It was published by Popcorn Books as an ebook as well in 2021, and then in hard copy format in 2022. Popcorn Books specializes from their website's foreign rights catalog on quote unquote exciting fiction for young adults that touch on topics which are sadly still regarded as controversial in today's Russia. LGBTQ+, self-identification, racism and sexism, mental health issues, and more. In October 2021, Kozha was shortlisted for the Nos Wander Award, which publicly debates its selections for its shortlist in a really novel way of doing things. You can find this on YouTube. This sort of public debate about why they've chosen the books they've chosen. One of the jury members, Denis Kornievsky, he expressed when he picked this book to be on the shortlist that he knew he was going against the opinion of some critics, and that when he first started reading the book, he expected cultural appropriation to be an issue with this white author's representation of an enslaved Black woman. However, he found that Nekrasova skillfully plays homage to Southern Black American female writers in stylizing her novel with some hallmarks of the languages used by the latter within the genres in which they dominate, including magical realism. Kozha went on to win this Nos Wander Prize in 2022. The author herself addresses the issues of cultural appropriation in the foreword to the 2022 hard copy version of the novel. She says, after sort of giving her own family background, in which she says she's a Mordvinian descent, I believe 1/8 Mordvinian descent, and she believes that she knows some of her ancestors were serfed. She says, I have the right, wait, I might have this for you, Russian. She says, I have the right to write fiction about myself and about Russian serfs because of my white skin. I do not have the right to write fiction about enslaved Black people. But maybe I have the right to try because of the shared experience of slavery of our ancestors, because of shared modern prejudices, sort of most immediately against everyone with non-white skinned, and also fairly strongly against things such as accents or sort of foreign looking Russian names, things like this. But most of all, she says she has the right maybe to try to write about the life of an enslaved Black woman because of my love for Black people's literature and folklore. So that is her foreword to the novel. And I can say certainly, that Nekrasova's familiarity with Black art and literature is felt throughout the novel. She says she was directly inspired to write about an enslaved Black woman alongside an enslaved a Russian serf from reading Toni Morrison's Beloved and Bluest Eye. The Bluest Eye, which she says sort of trips one up and ties one up in knots. Sort of pointedly says that because the beginning of the novel starts with, I tripped over a skull, sort of. Okay, so in addition to Toni Morrison, there are lots of other intertexts here. There's Octavia Butler's Kindred. There's also Nancy Prince's narrative of her life and travels in both Russia and Jamaica, which Nekrasova has gone on record as saying she read to sort of prepare for writing this novel. Now, the novel itself centers around two women in the 19th century, one in Russia, one in the United States. The Black enslaved woman, her name is Hope. She spells it, it's not Nadezhda, it's Hope in the book. And there's an enslaved a Russian woman, and her name is Donna, which is a very interesting choice for a name. It's from the Greek, it's the feminine form of the Greek master or lord. And so it almost seems as if she names these characters. It almost seems as though as you're reading, she names these characters for the thing which their group of people sort of lack the most or are diametrically opposed to, right? Like the hopelessness of chattel slavery in the United States and the lack of mastery over oneself in Imperial Russia. In my personal opinion, the novel is incredible. One of the most incredible things about it is that Nekrasova does not use proper nouns. Only Donna and Hope have names. And interestingly enough, one other has a name. It's a bear, whose name is Natasha. She's a talking bear, which a lot of, and I'll show you briefly in a moment, many readers in Russia were very upset that there was a talking bear. There's talking bears in Russia. This was not, this one might say was less her being like Russia hating or spreading Russian stereotypes about Russia, and more of her love of folklore, right? Which comes up in several places. For example, the skull that the narrator trips up over at the beginning of the story is taken from West African folklore of the talking skull, sort of represents Black Americans as they transported the story from the Middle Passage to here. Black Americans wanting to be in touch, communicating with their ancestors or an ancestral past, right? She also has this beautiful figure on the cover of her book, who I'm pretty sure is supposed to represent Vinoruki, which is her word for Makosh, which is a folkloric house spirit from the Slavic realm. And there's several different kinds of folklore mixed up from the Slavic realm and from West African Black American context. Overall, however, these elements sort of serve to guide us and give us a kind of otherworldly context to the route from bonded labor to some kind of freedom for both Domna and Hope. Domna and Hope, in a really unexpected way, come to meet each other in Russia. I don't want to spoil, I really don't want to give too many details of the book because I hope people will read it. They come to meet and they learn they can exchange skin. They literally, and these are some of the most beautiful scenes in the novel, they literally, Hope has traveled with, I guess I'll just give a little bit of context. Hope has traveled with, she's been bought off of a really vicious sugar plantation. She is traveling with the person who bought her. He bought her because she can write. And he wants to force her to sort of be another Phyllis Wheatley. He wants to force her to create poetry so that he can take sort of fame for, oh, look, I found this really smart Black slave who writes poetry. He gets sort of ran out of one of the cities. There are no proper names in this book. I assume this city may have been Boston, though, from the description. They get ran out of Boston, and he angers someone's there, and he thinks he'll go to Russia then. He'll go to Russia and see if he can find some celebrity for her there. In their travels, they come across this village where Domna has been really dehumanized. There's been a lot of rape committed against her. It's a very long story, but Hope finds her, and in the end of that chapter, the sentence is, and she recognized her. She walked into the hut and saw Domna there, sort of at her lowest and degraded, and sort of like chained to some piece of furniture there. And she frees her, and then they just, without words, exchange skin. They just recognize each other's suffering to that extent, and they exchange skin. So they do this, and you're thinking, oh, okay, interesting, how is this gonna work? And it's incredible how it works and does not work. This is maybe the place from which pessimism becomes part of the novel. One might think Domna and Hope might be able to find different kinds of freedoms for themselves in different skins. Maybe Hope will return to America with white skin and she'll be able to free her mother, easy peasy. Or Domna now with black skin, and I think it was 1842 or 47, I'm terrible with numbers. Nicholas I did draft an edict, proclaimed that any black-skinned formerly enslaved person would be free as soon as they step foot in Russia. So it seems like, oh, maybe they'll be free now that they have different skins on them. And this is, of course, terribly not the case. It's also where Natasha Libera comes in to play in a sort of mediation on what it means to be dehumanized and whether or not that necessarily depends on the color of one's skin. Domna, as a Black woman, Domna as Hope, as she's called in this part of the novel, she ends up working for a titled lady, and then differently a proper lady, as sort of a decorative servant. Right, she's still objectified in that way. She still sort of only has movement tied. She only has like sort of social mobility or social hopes tied to these landed ladies and their whims. It's a very performative, objectified life she lives. And Hope as Domna actually stays in Russia in her white skin. And she works for a like capitalistic bread baron in the south of Russia, where she also comes to see the abject situation, not only for herself, but for other peasants in Russia, even with their white skin, obviously, for the daughters specifically of landowners in Russia. That there's just this sort of inhuman cruelty that's pervading these entire systems that happen to sometimes express themselves in sort of a non-colorblind racism. In any event, I wanted to share some of the reviews from the reader reviews, the Russian reader reviews, and their reaction to Kozha. There were many more positive reviews than I thought there would be. Actually, I was shocked. I'm always scared about online comments, so it's very scary to get through them. But here we see someone says, you know, it was actually the relationship between Domna and Hope, both before they switched bodies, during switching bodies, after switching bodies, again, right? That made the biggest impression on them. Even in the context of so much sort of cruelty that surrounded these beautiful scenes, these beautiful intimate scenes of them sort of delicately unzipping each other's skin and stepping into it. And I mean, it's very vivid. Sort of their naked muscles and mass dripping with blood, but just sort of delicately putting on each other's skin. Lots of people were also really drawn to the folklore that pervades the novel. And for me, the folklore is exactly the folklore and the decision to not name, to not use these proper names. Even Petersburg and Moscow are, Первый город в моей второй стране, or the второй город, which you can like make out from context as she talks, which is Petersburg and which is Moscow. Russia is not Russia, it's дикая холодная страна. America is not America, it's дикая жаркая страна. It's like the way that she names things or refuses to name them is one of the most powerful decolonial parts of her novel, in a way that I think Saidiya Hartman would enjoy, because it's part of deconstructing and unsettling this like overrepresentation of what is knowable, who is man, who is subhuman, who is rational or not. What can we know about the physical world? What can we know about the biological world? And she just does a beautiful job with all of this. And this includes, this decoloniality includes this attention to folklore, because folklore is, of course, other ways of knowing, right? These are pre-humanist other ways of knowing who is human and what a human is. So many people who were reading just thought it was incredible to see how, with the help of folklore, but also folklore that is not appropriation, because she is not naming, and she actively writes the novel with these terms, right? She doesn't even, she uses the word slave once, at the very end, when the skull is talking. Otherwise, they're rabataishi or ni rabataishi, workers, people who aren't working, or teachers, or the son of, or nadzarayashi, like people who are overseeing. She never uses these sort of these proper nouns to avoid sort of cliche, but also the idea of cultural appropriation. So people were born sort of attracted to all of this, but some recognized the sort of extreme intersectionality of this kind of feminism. One of my favorite comments is that only all of the terrible comments about the book were from users who had male names and things like this. But actually, to be quite fair, it was not only males who had, it was largely males, but there are also some women who were either confused or did not appreciate the novel. People kept saying that the repetition of these sort of non-named objects, right? Upravlayashi, Rabatayashi, Холодная страна, жаркая страна, like this sort of repetition was hard for them to grasp. And that maybe because of this method, they didn't like love the novel. Others were kind of waiting for this to be kind of like maybe funny, Freaky Friday situation where they switch bodies, and it's comedic how much they like don't really know about each other's culture. As Wojciech says in his his review. But again, it's a sort of part of Nekrasova's project, in my opinion. The point is that there is no essentialized fact of knowledge about either of these cultures. Like part of the point is we probably need to get away from those ways of knowing what culture is and what man is in general. But I can go through other reviews if people want later, but I will just say that the most pressing question that this left me with was in the context of Afro-pessimism, which points out that in its opinion, other theoretical frameworks can't explain the gratuitous violence against Black people because they don't recognize the humanist understandings of the human subject that they see as coterminous with anti-Blackness and Black social death. So this is sort of, again, reminiscent of Sylvia Wynter and the fact that race and the idea of race indifference is coterminous with this new humanist idea of man as rational and trying to divide up who's human and who's not human, who's man and who's not man. Afro-pessimists think that sort of slavery continued even after the death of Confederate slavery, and in a sense, Black people can never escape this being marked in this way. So they need to escape the world because reform and debate will not solve their issue. And this escape could mean anything from literal personal suicide to the creation of these imaginative, speculative worlds. But a question that I was left with, and I hope others will be thinking about if they get a chance to read the novel, is that if Afro-pessimism believes that the global anti-Blackness consensus can be explained by the unique phenomena of Arab and transatlantic Black slave trades, then what do we make of Russian serfdom? Were not Russian serfs in a similar position reached social death and existence at the margins of a civil society that was set up in opposition to them, as Nekrasova says when she brings up her Morbinian ethnicity? Did not the abolition of their enslavement mirror the former slaveholders' logic of, we've given you freedom, so now you're in our debt? And I think the novel is most fruitful if we do put it in conversation with Afro-pessimism and its intertexts, which include Toni Morris and Saidiya Hartman, Sylvia Wynter, Frank Wilderson, of course, and think about how Afro-pessimism doesn't quite touch on serfdom as a system similar to slavery in the United States, and where Russia might lie in that frame of things. Because it's not as if Russia fits neatly into Sylvia Wynter's idea of the rise of Europe and sort of Europe versus the rest, or West versus the rest, which is a very common refrain in Slavic studies. Like, is Russia the West or is it the rest? So yeah, I will just end it there. But thank you for indulging.
Thank you, Christy. This was really a fantastic talk, and I hope we have questions both from our physical but also from our virtual audience. And maybe for our virtual listeners, if they can raise their virtual hands in case questions, and then Sasha will, I'll call on you and Sasha will help unmute you. But yes, if you can. Yeah.
Thank you, Christy. This was really wonderful. I haven't read the book, unfortunately, even after we talked. There hasn't been time, but I will, after this, definitely do it. I was curious about the frame, indeed. You know, the sort of thing that you sort of moved towards questioning towards the end, right? So it seems from the description, your description of the novel, that right, that not much changes after the exchange of the skin for the two women. That what actually turns out to matter is a certain positionality within a structure of oppression that will get you regardless of the skin color that you have. Right, so then, right, so then is Afro-pessimist framework really, I mean, I guess I'm asking you to say a little bit more about why this is the appropriate frame, as opposed to what strikes me as again, from your summary, as what seems central, which is again the worker versus the non-worker, questions of class. Right, it seems to work almost in that way, again, from your to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so try not to give so much of the novel away. It's actually very difficult to get my hands on it because it came out in hard copy in 2022, and of course, borders were closed after the invasion of Ukraine. So I actually had to find it on eBay and have it shipped to me from Poland. So that's how I got it. Because at the time I didn't know that it was also just an audiobook on Bookmate. There is a lot going on in the novel. So not much changes for them in terms of being objectified and not being able to be the masters in a certain sense of their own personal destiny initially. But Domna as Hope in Hope's black skin actually in Russia lives a life with servants. She's sort of like a show horse for this titled lady. She's the titled lady's servant, but she also sort of trots her around. It's like, oh, look, this is really cool. I married her also to my black gourmet chef, and I'm from France, and they have a little house together with their own servants. Isn't this so neat? I'm so like blagorodny. So there is still oppression there, of course, but eventually Domna's new owner who brought her to Russia finds her, because it's not hard to do. They say like she's one of 12, 12 black people in Russia, and she lives with this very high-ranking lady who's actually a distant relative of the Tsar. He finds her and recaptures her and takes her back to the United States. And Domna, inside of Hope's body, she sort of just like breaks down when she's sent to the sugar plantation. Like it's not anything like what she was used to eat. Even as Nekrasova sort of describes it, even sort of seeing other Russian serfs working on the fields and then tending their own lots and things like that, it is different in that way. Hope in Domna's body, she's still subject to her own violence. She's attacked on the road by someone in her wagon. They steal all of her materials that she brought from Russia, her savings from working to sort of buy her mother's freedom. Yes, there is violence everywhere in the novel. But one does get the sense there is something different going on in the United States. And Domna feels it when she's there and when she's subjected to that kind of chattel slavery, which Nekrasova in the novel does mark as different in the same way that Afro-pessimism marks the transatlantic slave trade as different. Because I guess if I would have to describe it, it seems in the novel, both women are definitely objectified. There's violence against both of them. But the question of sort of animality, I guess, the subhuman,
Mhm.
sort of only comes up in relation to dominus skin.
Mhm.
It's, yeah, and I want to say that it's not that. It's not that I think Afro-pessimism in conversation with this novel would want to say something like, ooh, look, like slavery's worse than serfdom. Like, that's incredibly ridiculous. So just a ridiculous thing to say. In fact, Juliet Hooker says, when we think about solidarity and the problem of solidarity, something that is probably a much more effective method is not comparison, which assumes all kinds of things already about what will be similar and what will be different, just juxtaposition, just bare juxtaposition. And to think about these two things side by side, regardless of what you came to this juxtapositioning with, like thinking you know about these two things, when you put them side by side, what do you see? And it's, I would argue, I think it's only through sort of Afro-pessimism's way of critiquing an entire field of knowledge around what is human, that it does link to humanist Renaissance, scientific projects, and the Age of Discovery. That we can think these legacies of serfdom and slavery together as truly dehumanizing, like in the worst sense. It's not as if, and in her novel, it's not as if other things don't matter, right? It's not as if gender doesn't matter. It's not as if class doesn't matter. But this idea of who's human and not, sort of really hinges on these understandings of the physical, the bodily, the biological, the physical, the relation to nature. So I think it just, those nuances are clearer, I think, when we put this in a conversation with Afro-pessimism.
Cole?
I was really fascinated by your discussion at the beginning of being in Russia during Putin's third inauguration. I think it's really interesting to think of that inauguration in parallel with Trump's recent election, considering that, again, he was out of office for those 4 years prior to his inauguration. Trump's out of office for 4 years prior to this. I want to ask you, what parallels do you see? What differences, and what can you draw specifically from this in terms of like what might be to come, and even looking at what's happened in Russia in the past, 8 years or so? Or I know that's a really good.
Thank you for asking that question, because I have not even brought it up in my talk, but I think something again that Afro-pessimism brought me to when thinking about this idea of whiteness, which some Afro-pessimists they're not concerned necessarily, again, with the specific skin color as a marker of whiteness, or what is human or not human, but sort of ideology around whiteness, which is also interesting because this figure also comes up over the course of the novel as a sort of boogeyman for the narrator. She calls it like a skinless figure in the form of a woman. This sort of abstract man, sort of creeping around and surprising people and making them rethink, who am I in relation to this sort of humanity. I think what's similar about Russia and the United States and these legacies of serfdom and slavery is, unfortunately, an unwillingness to break away from that claim of being somehow like the heirs of sort of Western civilization and Western civilization's concept of what and who man is. I think it's clear in the case of the United States, make America great again, right? Take it back to the 1920s when we were you know, right, when we were sort of terrorizing immigrants and lynching Black people, let's make it great again, right? Let's take it back. We don't, America is white, right? This is, that's the subtext. It's not even that nuanced. America is, that's what makes America great. There's, I think in the Russian case, it's not, again, so much about specifically skin color, although that comes up in some cases when we talk about who's marked as Black in Russia, right? Who folks from the Caucasus or folks from Central Asia, right? Who's marked here as for social death. For me, I guess the parallel is that at certain moments in time, when progress seems like it could be near, towards an actually free conception of the human in these societies, there's always a scaredness to relinquish this humanist conception of man that revolves around difference, that revolves around whatever difference it might be, right? Racial difference, most prominently in the United States, somewhat in Russia, but also gender difference or class difference or national difference. There's always a no, we are civilized. We are marked as part of what the West is, as part of civilization. And to prove that, we have to construct another. Like that's how civilization in sort of the Afro-pessimist account was even conceived at the age of discovery. It was marking us from others. So, I mean, I think Russia tries to play that same game. Like we're just as great as Europe. We're not Western, but we're European, or we're not European, but we're Western. They still want to hold on that sort of legacy, that they are part of it. And I think relinquishing that would be incredible. I think that'd be an incredible step towards a freer society. But that, and I think, Rossin, you bring this up in your article about contemporary Russian liberals' racism and anti-communism, right? It's the scaredness to be outside of Western society that makes them compete with Western society and reproduce the violence of Western society as they sort of compete to also be up there, to be at this non-nadir. So there's like no, it's pessimism because there's no like easy way out of it, right? You can't just say like, oh, we're just gonna wholesale get rid of everything that's come with Western civilization to be more free. But I think creative cultural works like Nekrasova's are a step in that direction, right? Of unnaming and renaming and remaking sorts of knowledge about who is human and how we can see that in each other outside of the sort of terms of like Renaissance era, discovery era, Western humanism.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's probably very commonly abstract answer.
I have a question, which comes as a literary historian. I always try to put texts in a genealogy, and I really struggle to come up with a text or an author in the Russian tradition who really attempts such an identification or radical solidarity with African Americans. Even though, I mean, as we know, there is with Americans, Russian cultural producers, since probably the middle of the 19th century, have had this intense fascination and comparison and identification, which has, if anything, grown even stronger with time, even technically now, nowadays when the official politics is under Westernism, but culturally there is such an intense adoption of also every American fact. But with regard to African Americans, I really struggle. Maybe Edward Limonov, who in his radical gesture, has this description of his autobiographical character having sex with an African American man in New York. But really, there is. Can you think of any kind of literary precedents for the kind of radical solidarity and Nekrasova's?
Only one comes to mind. Okay, three things. Only one comes to mind immediately, and there's an author for NLO. His name is Alexander Stesen, and he does like autofiction, contemporary Russian autofiction. And he actually he's a doctor. He got his degree in English in New York, I think Buffalo, and then he became a doctor, and he spent decades doing the rounds. I mean, that's the name of his book in Russian. I mean, in English, but I don't think it's been translated yet, though. He did the rounds at like several different hospitals all over New York, and he writes about it, and he writes about sort of coming into contact. I mean, not only with Black Americans and Caribbean Americans and African Americans, but also like, I mean, yeah, Americans Filipino, or like descendants. Like it's incredible the way he writes. And maybe that reminds me a little bit of Limonov, the way that he's seeking to understand his own identity by thinking about it, again, juxtapositioning it to other sort of minority identities of the United States. He also has another book called The African Book, where he does a similar thing. Like he does his rounds in different countries in Africa, including Madagascar and Ghana, and he writes about that in Russian. It's really incredible. Most people have, a lot of what I saw in reviews actually compared her to I'm so terrible with names all the time. Oh my goodness. Soviet era author, very strange, but interesting, writes sometimes about Central Asia. Andrei Platonov, of course, amazing. Yeah, so lots of people compared her actual like use of language and the sort of отстранение, the sort of estrangement from the world itself, and in a way that I think is complementary to what Platonov is doing when he's writing about
There's a bear too.
My goodness, these bears. It was actually,
Talking
yeah, it was actually really sad. Like there's so many beautiful moments in this novel that are just also sad. And I think she herself, Nekrasova, she's beautiful at doing this. She herself, without naming the piece of fiction that she's creating as an intertext, she'll just describe it. So over the course of the novel, with Donna and Hope read or hear about things like what would become the plot for Golublovi, for example. They read and know about Bronze Horseman. They know about a house in Kolomna. It's like Pushkin's definitely an intertext. Saltykov-Shchedrin. She drops like also not only literature, but that's Talking Skull itself is a reference to a Black artist of the early 20th century. She drops a reference to Beyonce, Idol. She's just, it's all over the place and it's beautiful, but I agree. I don't think, and I think that's one of the interesting things about it. I don't think I've read a like direct juxtaposition. I don't even know. I mean, I think I would call it the closest thing to it, I would say, in my opinion, is Octavia Butler's Kindred. Although, again, because she's interested in corporality, and I think because this all fits so neatly within this sort of Afro-pessimistic critique of humanist man, a sort of natural, biological, physical, she's interested in crossing that color line literally physically, whereas Octavia Butler is doing it temporally, do the sort of trick of time travel, right? Sort of mystical time travel. This is like literally I am stepping into the skin of another. But I think that's probably the most direct intertext. So it's somewhere between, I don't know, like fantasy and magical realism. But I agree with your sentiment. I've never read anything like it, so.
And that particular episode of the two women exchanging skin, you know, that really reminded me of another, not contemporary, but at least relatively recent novel, Andrei Volos's Huramobat, where at least a few of the chapters are structured around the question of, is it possible for a person to change their ethnicity? And in one such chapter, or you know, these are self-standing stories. We have an ethnic Russian coming to Dushanbe, to Tajikistan, and I'm becoming an ethnic Tajik. In a way that's really structured like a scientific anthropological experiment, you know, recognize upon the achievement of this. But
Please give me the name of that.
yes.
I wanna read that.
Any other questions, Emma?
Hi, I had to step out briefly, so I do apologize if someone's already asked this. I'm interested in what the kind of broader, like, institutional and maybe political reception of this text was. You talked a lot about reviews, but I don't know if it has made like much of a splash more broadly, if there's been broader kind of cultural and political commentary on the novel. I'd be really interested to hear.
There was some, well, yes, actually, let me, broader, I'm not sure, but in the context of how people were reacting to it. Yeah, let me just full screen. Oh my gosh. Oh, okay, I can say that. Oh my goodness. Okay. I think it was critically and popularly received pretty well. It did win. It was nominated for a couple of awards, including the NOS. It won the regional NOS Wanderer Award, actually. And critics were generally positive, although there were critics on the left and the right. Some on the left, I'm not sure if they read the novel or not, though. I can't. I'm pretty sensitive to things like cultural appropriation, I feel, and I just didn't. I was skeptical. I was scared opening it and reading it. I didn't know what it would be like, but I don't find cultural appropriation. But there was conversation in Russian media and journals and interviews with her about, did you, were you scared you were going to like commit appropriation, or is this just appropriation full stop, just because she's writing from the point of view of a Black woman for half of the novel? On the right, it was probably what, or honestly, it could be on the, could just be contemporary liberal view. For example, one woman says, книга хорошо написана человеком, который нравится Америка. Как можно давать премию в России за произведение, где используется нелюбовь к стране? Because there's talking animals in Russia, and because they think, I don't know why. I found both protagonists, most people who read it found both protagonists really touching and really sort of leaving an impression, but some people who wrote comments like this one, Ekaterina's here, some of them were like, oh no, she just loves America, and why is our krepostnaya domna, why is she so stupid and weak, and she's just like a secondary character. It's you know, to the specifics of you know, I couldn't read this because of all the repetition of sort of the non formal nouns, proper nouns. There's so many euphemisms, and there's not a lot of beauty. It's so hard to read. The heroes are suffering, so just let the reader suffer too, right? And не дай бог, не обидит никакое меньшинство. Like And of course, like, maybe she wrote it this way because she didn't want to offend anyone. I mean, she says she wrote it this way because she doesn't want to make use of cliches, and she is trying to be decolonial. She says that, but she does not want to essentialize any culture. She's creating like a juxtaposition that's supposed to create sort of productive conversation. And some people just were not happy about it in predictable and unpredictable ways. But I don't believe it's been translated into any other language yet. But so far, most of the public seems to have liked it a lot. Some people said it was the best sort of, even just like feminist literature they've read in decades. They just thought it was incredible. So yeah, I hope more people will read it. It is, I think, still available as an audiobook on Bookmate, I believe.
George?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really wonderful talk. I was wondering if you had found any kind of generic footprints coming in or out of the kind of horror world here.
Oh,
Yeah, just especially with the kind of question of bringing up Butler and the Black horror renaissance in the United States, in cinema at least. What's going on with that? Sort of wondering.
okay, so yes. Many of the people who specifically rated it on Bookmates, they said that in addition to being like sort of unbelievable and incredible and all these things, a lot of the tags they gave to it in their reviews were just like scary. And I mean, there are, again, I think that's part of the point. Nekrasova is sort of painting this like idea of the human as this looming amorphous almost fear, this fear and this like paralyzing fear, like what to do about it, like put skin on it, you know, make it different. How do we figure out what it is or what it is not? People did say like they were brought to tears, but also at certain points that they like had nightmares and like would wake up and be like, oh, where am I? Which very viscerally reminds me of Butler's Kindred. Like, where am I? Like, is this still happening? One of the most perceptive reviews is this one where he, the writer, who is a male, not all terrible reviews for males, thankfully, but it says, oh, I cut off the first part of it. No, история о всевозможных формах рабства и о страхе, что это навсегда. It's like we're never gonna escape these kinds of unfreedoms, right? Like, how do we? And these characters, these like amorphous characters, sort of haunting both Domna and Hope, remind me of Morrison's Beloved, right? They're just, it's something like they can't let go of. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's frightening. In the case of Makosh or Vinaruki for Domna, or there's a like a car-colored girl with button eyes in two of the scenes with Hope, who is in the sugar forest and sugar plantation forest, and she is helpful but also menacing. It's you know, and I think a lot of the atmosphere of fear is not only from the sort of meta question of sort of the fear of what is human and can we ever escape these kind of imprisoned ways of thinking about the boundaries of the human, but also just from the digging into folklore to help us get a grasp on that, right? Because a lot of folklore is ambiguous in that sense, like Baba Yaga, right? Like sometimes she's helpful and sometimes she's not. Sometimes she's terrifying. And so the same happens here throughout. And yeah, people definitely. I mean, I have like a 9-month-old son, and he's obsessed with this cover. Like the first time he saw it, I was like, oh my God, please don't look at that. Like, it's so scary. I don't want to like just have like nightmares somehow when he grows up. But yeah, there are definitely horror elements. Thank you for asking that question.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Christy, this is really, yes, I will likely have to order it immediately and read it, and thank you for everybody for coming here and getting enlightened. Yes.